Growing up, I had always been intrigued by the stories my cousin would tell me about his encounters with the unknown. He lived on a vast property that had been in our family for generations, with the nearest neighbor miles away. The isolation only seemed to fuel the strange occurrences that seemed to happen there. I was never sure whether to believe his tales, but I always found them fascinating, and they had a way of sticking with me long after our conversations had ended. I was in my late 20s when I finally had the opportunity to visit his property for an extended stay, something I'd been meaning to do for a long time. Having recently been laid off from my job, I found myself with an abundance of free time and thought that a trip to the countryside would be a welcome reprieve from the monotony of city life. I packed my bags and headed out, excited to see the place that had been the setting for so many of my cousin's stories and to spend some quality time with him. Upon my arrival, I was struck by the beauty and vastness of the land. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, covered in thickets of trees and dotted with the occasional pond. The serenity alone of the landscape was in stark contrast to the chaos of the city that I had left behind. I felt a sense of peace wash over me as I took it all in. My cousin's home, an old but well-maintained farmhouse, was nestled in the heart of the property, surrounded by a sprawling garden that he tended with great care. Over the first few days of my visit, my cousin and I spent our time exploring, fishing in the ponds, and talking about past experiences. It was on the fourth night, as we sat beneath the vast expanse of the night sky, that he first mentioned the strange black cube he had seen on several occasions. He described it as unlike any aircraft he had ever seen, moving silently through the sky and vanishing as quickly as it would appear. I listened intently, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as he recounted his experiences with this mysterious cube. A few nights later, he suggested that we go on a nighttime hike to a nearby hilltop, offering a perfect panoramic view of the entirety of the area. He had a hunch that it would be a good place to potentially spot this craft. Equipped with flashlights and a sense of adventure, we set out under the cover of darkness, the cool night air carrying the distant sounds of wildlife and rustling leaves. As we ascended the hill, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of anticipation mixed with unease. The isolation and darkness of the night seemed to almost amplify the mysterious atmosphere, and I found myself glancing around nervously, half expecting to see something out of the ordinary. Once we reached the summit, he was right. The view was breathtaking. The stars above shone like brilliant tapestry, and the faint outlines of the hills and forests stretched out before us, illuminated only by the soft glow of the moon. We sat down, scanning the sky in silence, waiting for any sign of the elusive craft. As the hours wore on, I began to grow tired. It seemed that this thing was not going to make an appearance. Just as I was about to suggest that we head back, my cousin suddenly grabbed my arm, his voice barely a whisper as he pointed to a spot in the sky. I followed his gaze, and my heart leapt into my throat as I saw it. A sleek, black object gliding effortlessly through the sky, its dark silhouette standing out against the backdrop of stars. It made no sound as it moved. I found myself unable to tear my eyes away from the incredible sight. It seemed to almost defy the laws of physics, changing direction and speed with an ease that no conventional aircraft could possibly achieve. I felt a mixture of awe, fear, and disbelief wash over me as I was trying to process what I was witnessing. My cousin and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, confirming that we were both seeing the same thing. He had a look of vindication on his face, as if years of sharing his experiences with skeptics had finally been validated by my presence. The craft continued to maneuver through the sky, performing feats that seemed impossible. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of beings could even have created such an advanced vehicle. As we watched, the craft suddenly came to a halt, hovering in place as if observing us from afar. I felt a chill run down my spine, the sensation of being watched by something beyond my understanding. The craft seemed to stay perfectly still for a moment, and then, without warning, vanished, as if disappearing from view in the blink of an eye. We sat in stunned silence for a while, trying to comprehend what we had not only just witnessed, but what happened. After some time, we began our descent back to the house, our minds both racing with questions and theories about the craft and its origins. The encounter had left me with a newfound appreciation for the unknown and a deep sense of humility in the face of the vast universe that stretched out above us. Over the following days, my cousin and I would spend hours discussing the sighting and even speculating about what it could mean. We would return to that hilltop on several other occasions, hoping to catch another glimpse, but it never happened. After I returned home, the memory of that night still sticks in my mind. I feel like it's forever altered my perception of the world and the mysteries that lie in wait. The most profound and life-changing moments seem to happen when we least expect them. This story actually isn't even scary. It's more interesting, and the more I think back on it, I still have no idea what animal this was. I moved to a small town in Idaho for the summer. I was just 7 years old at the time. I already loved exploring the great outdoors. One summer evening, I remember sneaking out of the house after my parents had gone to bed. The moon was full and the air was calm, with the smell of pine trees and wildflowers wafting all through the air. After going some ways through the tall grass, I noticed what appeared to be a large dog moving in the distance. Thinking it was just a large regular dog, I moved closer, but it was moving in my direction, and the closer it got, I realized it was something entirely different. It had a long, bushy tail and big, curious eyes that seemed to glow. It was mysterious, but did not appear threatening at all. It was almost as if it was grooming me. It came off as curious, like it wanted to know about me. It approached me, sniffing me and tilting its head in the air from side to side, as if trying to figure out what I was. I was nervous, especially as it stood up on 2 legs, which I didn't think about when I was 7. But it seemed gentle and non-threatening. There was this atmosphere around us that made me feel safe. I could see in the mixture of the light, it was a grayish-brown. It was very long and slender, but also bulky in the chest. It wasn't a dog, but it was like no other animal I'd ever seen before. Slowly, I reached out my hand. It came even closer, allowing me to touch it. I spent the next few minutes just sitting there in the moonlit field, gently touching the creature. It seemed to display no emotion. I knew I had to head back home. I was worried sick that my parents would find out. I stood up and began to walk away. This thing followed me for a little while, which made me nervous. But eventually, it stopped at the tree line as it watched me make my way back up to the house. I never saw it again after that, and whatever this mysterious dog-like creature was left a lasting impression on me. The way it approached me with curiosity and without fear or aggression taught me that sometimes the unknown can be beautiful and very gentle. Like I said, I never saw it again, but I'll always remember that night. My encounter took place a few years ago in the rural outskirts of my hometown in Maine. I never really thought much about it until recently, when I stumbled upon stories of the Dogman on the internet. I'd always brushed off my experiences as simply overactive imagination, but reading about other people's encounters made me reconsider my own. I was 19 at the time, working at a local diner and living with my parents. I would usually finish work around midnight and make the 30-minute drive back home through the dark, all through the winding roads surrounded by thick forests. It was during the beginning of fall, and the nights were getting colder and darker. One night, I was driving home from work, and as usual, the roads were almost completely deserted. I was listening to music, trying to stay awake, when I noticed something strange up ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, as they were common in the area. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. This creature was standing on the side of the road, almost bending in with the shadows of the trees. It had a tall, slender frame and appeared to be covered in matted, messy fur. Even its features were horrific. It had pointed ears and a snout resembling a wolf. But there was something that was so unsettling, so human about its posture and the way it stared me down as I approached. I slowed down my car, trying to get a better look at this strange thing. It seemed to be observing me just as curiously, tilting its head as if to get a better view. Its eyes were glowing a faint, eerie yellow in the headlights of my vehicle. It stood there, completely still, as if it was trying to decide what to make of me. My curiosity quickly turned to fear as I realized how close I was to this thing. I was alone on this desolate road, and there was no telling what this thing was capable of. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly accelerated, trying to put as much distance between me and this thing as possible. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw that this thing was slowly stepping back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that it was still there, watching me. I recall spending the rest of the drive home in a state of heightened paranoia. I never saw it again, and I didn't really tell anybody about this experience, fearing that they would think I was crazy. But after reading about other people's experiences with the Dogman, I can't help but wonder if what I saw was something more than just a figment of my imagination. To this day, I still get chills when I think about the way it stared at me, as if it was trying to decipher what I was. I feel grateful that I never had to find out, but the memory of that night will always stick in my brain. During a summer camping trip with a group of friends in the vast wilderness of Colorado, I experienced something I never thought I would. We were all in our early 20s, eager to explore nature and bond over the shared experience. Little did I know, this trip would introduce me to a creature that I never even heard of before, leaving me with a chilling memory. Our campsite was located in a remote area, far from any major roads or towns. It took us several hours of driving through winding dirt roads and hiking to reach our destination. The beauty of the surrounding landscape, filled with tall pine trees, lush greenery, and a nearby crystal-clear river, made the effort well worth it. On the second night of our trip, after spending the day hiking and fishing, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. As the night progressed and the fire began to die down into embers, we decided to call it a night and retreat to our tents. I've always been sort of a light sleeper, so it was no surprise when I awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of leaves rustling. I thought it might be one of my friends, but a quick glance around the campsite revealed that everyone was still in their tents. I decided to investigate the source of the noise, cautiously unzipping my tent and stepping out into the cool night air. As I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, my heart skipped a beat when the beam landed on a pair of glowing amber eyes, staring directly at me. They were too high off the ground to belong to a deer or a coyote, and the eyes seemed to have an intelligent, almost human-like quality to them. I tried to convince myself that it was just an unusually large wolf, or maybe even a bear. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to make out the creature's silhouette. It stood on two legs, like a human, but had the unmistakable features of a canine. Its body was thick, covered in dark fur, and it had a muscular build with long, powerful limbs. Its ears were pointed, and its snout elongated, similar to that of a German shepherd. It stood still, watching me with intensity. As fear began to rise, I fumbled for my pocket knife, unsure if it would offer any protection. Then it did something far more horrific. It grinned at me and casually walked on by, as if nothing was ever wrong. I was trying to process what I had just witnessed. I knew I had encountered something that defied explanation. The following morning, I shared my experience with my friends, but they dismissed it as a vivid nightmare, or the result of an overactive imagination. I couldn't blame them for their skepticism, but I knew deep down that what I had seen was real. My encounter with the creature had shaken me to my core, and I could not shake the feeling that it had been watching us through our entire camping trip. As we packed up and began the long trek back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, wondering if it was still watching us from a distance. The memory has stayed with me ever since, and it's a reminder that the wilderness holds many secrets we'll never know. My wife and I moved up here from Arizona in the summer of 2018. We bought a house on 2 acres, and we're still continually fixing it up ever since. I've been fortunate enough that I can work from home and run my business outside my home, so it enables me to be outside on my property every day, usually with my dog or just by myself. We've had some weird things happen, but nothing too crazy until yesterday. I was out there by myself. My dog had been acting weird all day and refused to go outside with me, so I decided to just let him stay inside. It was around 1 p.m., and I heard this loud bang from the back side of my property. I assumed it was a gunshot at first, but then I realized nobody would be shooting here in the middle of the day. And besides, there's no hunting season going on right now. so I kind of just shrugged it off and kept working for another hour before deciding to go and check out what made that noise. I walked around my property line towards where I heard the sound, and all of a sudden, something comes running from behind some trees about 30 yards away. It looked like an extremely muscular man wearing nothing but brown pants with long dark hair. It, or he, ran across the property line and into a thick patch of trees. You can imagine my complete and utter shock as I stood there for a second before running back to my house. I assumed there was some wild Neanderthal on the loose. I locked all the doors and windows, grabbed my .44, then went outside onto my deck overlooking where this thing had been. I sat there for about an hour or so, but did not see anything else moving around out there, just besides the usual birds and squirrels. So, the afternoon wasn't too weird until that happened. Today is another story, though. Today, while working on one of our rooms upstairs with music playing loudly through headphones, I hear this thud on my wall. Immediately, I took off my headphones, listening for any other noises, but I didn't hear anything else besides my own dog going crazy downstairs. I went down to find him hiding under one of the tables in our dining room, his tail tucked between his legs. This is not like him. So, being as dumb as I could possibly be, without taking a single weapon or anything, I decided to go out and check on what was going on. I step outside, and along the house, there are these horrendously large claw marks. They're running all along the side of the house, right where I'd heard the thud. So I go and take a picture and send it to my wife to see what she thinks. She's disturbed by it, but isn't sure what it could be. The claw marks are about 7 or 8 feet up off the ground. Very strange. I tell her I'll go and investigate. Maybe something was trying to get into our house. I looked around but did not find much. I did notice fresh dirt in one spot along the property line. This is where there are many trees and bushes growing up against one of our fences. It appeared as if someone had dug a rather large hole, probably maybe 3 to 4 feet wide, and it went down into a tunnel under the fence. It wasn't like what you'd expect where a dog or an animal would just dig underneath a fence line to get through. Whoever had dug this really took their time. But who did this, is what I was thinking. Who would come out to our property and dig a small tunnel? The tunnel shot down, and it was too dark for me to see where it led to. I spent the afternoon going out there with a shovel and filling it up as much as I could. The tunnel was surprisingly deep. As of now, it's in the evening time, and we have not had anything else weird happen yet. I'll be sure to write to you more if something does pop up. As for now, stay safe, and remember, always keep a firearm on you. I lived in Southern Oregon for a time. I was visiting my girlfriend, who lived in a trailer park. I had been staying up there with her for about 2 weeks, and had not seen anything out of the ordinary. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom. As soon as I stood up from my bed, I saw a pair of yellow eyes staring at me through the window. It was about 10 feet away, and it appeared to have its head cocked to one side, as if listening intently for something. I froze in place, not even breathing for fear that it would notice me. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds, it turned around and vanished from sight. I bolted to the bathroom, locked the door. Then, I decided to turn on every light I could. It was about 1 in the morning, so my girlfriend and her mother, who lived with her were asleep. I stayed up all night, with a knife from the kitchen drawer beside me, against whatever this was for protection. At around 4 a.m, there were scratching noises coming from outside the same window. I didn't dare look. At 5 a.m, the sun rose, and whatever it was had stopped making these awful groaning noises. I left as soon as my girlfriend woke up at around 6 to get ready for work. I never stayed there again after that night, and I'm not sure what it was. Well, about a week later, one of my friends asked me about the Native American jewelry that I often wore, and mentioned how cool it was. When I told him what had happened to me a few nights earlier, he freaked out at me and told me I needed to get rid of that stuff, that it would summon bad spirits. He wouldn't tell me what they were, but he said that I had been under the skinwalker's spell since wearing it, and I had to get rid of all signs that it was there. He would explain that these witches could shapeshift into the form of an animal and track down who wore these specific kinds of jewelry, which is what must have happened because nobody else that I know knew what I was talking about. He took these things from me and gave me sage and sweetgrass, used for protection against evil spirits. After hearing about skinwalkers from my friend, many other things became apparent that perhaps I had overlooked. My girlfriend would tell me that she had woken up a few other nights to scratching noises out her window, but she never saw anything. Her mom claims to have seen a tall, dark shadow lurking outside the trailer one evening on her way home. However, my girlfriend would sometimes wake up around 2 a.m. and see this same shadow moving outside her window. Many days after I left my girlfriend's house at night for good, I'd be driving down Interstate 5 into the early morning hours, probably about 20 miles south of Eugene. There have been times where I swear I see this large black dog on 2 legs running along the road. It seems like it's trotting, as if keeping pace with traffic. I've never seen this entity myself, in full, but I'm nervous to find out what it might be. I feel that the skinwalker incident and proximity to the large black dog that I can't physically see, that there must be something going on. I have a story for you. It's about my brother, and when we were kids in the mid-70s. We lived on a farm near Red Lion, Pennsylvania. It was a big place, lots of woods and fields. Our closest neighbor lived about a half-mile away down the road. Beyond that was just open farmland for miles. We also had 2 dogs, an Irish setter named Sam and a German shepherd named Shep. Both were good dogs, as they always made sure we knew when someone came to the door or if someone had trespassed onto our property. The dogs would always bark when someone came to the door, but on this day, they seemed far more frightened than guarded. My brother and I were home alone that day as our parents had gone out for the afternoon. It was a Saturday in April of somewhere in the mid-70s. We both remember it being sunny outside, no clouds in sight, and around noon or early afternoon. We were inside playing Pong, which my dad had bought us for Christmas earlier that year, so maybe it was closer to 79. I forget. It was then that we had heard the dogs start barking. They were both outside to go potty. We both looked at each other because it had been quiet for so long and wondered who or what could have caused them to bark. As we had lived there, they usually only ever bark if somebody was coming up to the house. As far as I knew, we weren't expecting any company. But as we listened, it became apparent that Shep was barking, and Sam sounded nervous and whining. We decided to go see what was going on. When we got to the door, Sam stopped barking, but Shep kept going. We looked out the window by the door and saw our 2 dogs sitting near a large tree only about 20 yards from the house. The dog we knew as Shep was barking at something behind the tree. My brother and I couldn't see what it was, but whatever it was had made a very loud sound that we later would describe as a high-pitched sound. We both looked at one another, and I remember my brother saying, "What the hell is that?" And I remember saying, "I don't know, but it's scaring me." We looked at each other for a few seconds, then decided to go outside. We did not have a gun, but we knew we had to do something. We opened the door and walked out onto our porch. As we did, the thing behind the tree stood up and turned around to face us. It was taller than the tree it had been standing behind. My brother and I both remember this very clearly, even after all these years. The face was pale and white, deep sunken-in blue eyes, and a mouth full of what I would describe as rotting teeth. It was gaunt. It looked sickly, like a starved prisoner of war, or that's what it reminded me of. I gasped at the sight of it. It never made a differing expression, other than its mono-looking face. It stood there for what seemed like forever, but was probably only about 5 seconds. My brother and I, out of fright, turned around and ran back into the house. We slammed the door shut and looked out the window to see if it was walking away from our house, back in the direction of the woods. Oh, I forgot to mention that when it stood up from a crouching position, both our dogs had started going nuts, and they actually ran back over to us because they were frightened. We didn't see where this thing went after it left. We never did see it again. It was a few months later that my parents finally told us and our brother that there are things on this property we can't understand. They never outright said what it was, but they pretty much alluded to what it was. They kept referring to it as evil and to be very careful. To this day, I still remember the face of that thing and the sound it made. I also remember how scared my brother and I were when we saw it. I felt its evil. It felt like it was emanating hatred. I don't know why it was on our property, but my parents had told us that they had seen it before, and that's why they always had an ample amount of gunfire in the house. I don't know if they've ever shot one, but after seeing that thing, I can honestly say I would have felt safer. I can also say that after seeing this thing, I never went outside without a gun until I was in my 30s and felt safer and more confident. It's weird looking back on that house because there was just this strange aura that surrounded the entire place. In addition to what I just told you, my parents experienced a host of strange, supernatural phenomenon. Everything you would expect from a typical haunting situation. As it turns out, there is a really old graveyard no more than 3 miles away from our house. If you were to go on the back side of that property, through some woods, you would get to it. It's actually one of the oldest in the area, and I've been told that some very notable witches have been buried there. I'm not sure if what we saw that evening has anything at all to do with what I just told you, but it is interesting. The farm has been sold and my parents have passed on, but I wish they would have told us more about what happened before they died. It's funny because my brother and I still laugh about that today. We do have a certain amount of fear, though. It's like when you're a kid and you see a scary movie, but then after seeing it, you still love watching those same movies. Thankfully for my brother and I, we really don't remember a whole lot of the hauntings that would occur in the house. I know that when my brother and I moved out for college, they were plagued by it for at least 3 years, and then suddenly stopped. Despite the eerie experiences we had on our farm, My brother and I had a pretty normal childhood. We spent most of our time outside, exploring the woods and fields, playing with our dogs. We never expected to come face to face with whatever we did. After that incident, my parents were more understandably cautious. They always made sure we had a gun in the house and warned us to be careful when we were outside, even though we never saw anything else as frightening as that. There were other strange occurrences in our house. One of them I remember specifically, well, not in the house, but was a large field my brother and I would play by our house. It always felt wrong after that initial experience. The best way I could summarize it was just, it felt unwelcoming, that you should not be there. And this was just a large empty field with tall grass. There was nothing there, but it just had this feeling. Even my father did not like us playing in that field. Sometimes I wonder if he knew something I did not. This story goes back to when I was 12. I was on Red Lake Indian Reservation in northern Minnesota, not far from where the movie Fargo was filmed. It's very rural, woods all around the house, prime wolf territory as well. I used to go outside all the time and play with friends. I was about 12 years old at the time. My sister and I were in our backyard, which is a large field that leads to a thick patch of woods. It was dusk, and we were playing. All of a sudden, these two creatures came out of the woods on all fours, but stood up in front of us. They were about 7 feet tall, covered in reddish hair. I can vividly remember the smell and how awful it was, like rotten meat or something very similar to that. The first thing that comes to my mind is roadkill that's been sitting out. They had no clothes on, but I don't remember seeing genitalia or nipples. These things were very muscular. Their faces reminded me of a cross between a wolf and human. They had long arms with hands that looked like they could grab things. Very similar to a raccoon's hands, actually. The fingers were long, but the thumbs were not big. The feet reminded me of a human's as well, but the toes were long and curved. I remember seeing these things in front of me, but my sister ran, and I followed her. We ran and ran till we got to the house, locking all the doors and windows. I kept seeing these things for the next 2 weeks. They were in the woods, and I would see them at night when I looked out my bedroom window, which faced the woods. One night, I saw one of them standing near a telephone pole, looking up at the sky, as if they were searching for something. Another night, I saw them near our chain-link fence. They were walking along it, looking around as if searching for something. I stopped seeing them after that, which is about 2 weeks. I thought it was strange that they disappeared so quickly. I never told anybody about this and didn't talk to my sister about it either. She had already been through enough with some of the childhood trauma that her and I endured. My mother passed away about 15 years ago now, and we never told her about this. I only told my father because at one point he had asked me if I'd ever seen anything strange when we lived in that house. So I openly told him about the creatures, and he said it was probably a wolf. But I know what a wolf looks like, and these things were not wolves. I am a proud Native American Cherokee, to be exact, and know what my people have seen on our reservations. These were not Native American wolves or any dogs I've ever seen. I've seen wolves, and these just were not like them. I'm a very serious person. I believe in God and the Bible. I did see these things with my eyes, and they were really there. I've never told anyone outside of my family and maybe a friend or two. My family has seen these creatures many times. I know there are others who have also seen them, but are afraid to talk about them. This area is full of stories, and I know you have heard many of them, but this is one for my family. My grandfather was an old traditional Native American man. He actually lived on the reservation in northern Minnesota and actually passed away when I was about 8. He was a medicine man and very spiritual. My family told me that he had seen these creatures many times while out in the woods hunting or gathering medicinal plants. He told my family that these were not normal animals and that we should be very careful while in the woods because it's not safe. He told my father that he should never go into the woods alone and to always take a rifle with him when going hunting or gathering plants. I remember when my grandfather passed, all of his family and friends were there to honor him and say goodbye. My father took me out to the garage where we keep all of our tools and hunting equipment. He had a pistol and 2 rifles on the table. My father told me that these are for protection because there are spirits in the woods that watch over us. They can sometimes be seen, but only by those who have the certain knack for it, that have the eyes to see. Anyway, my father told me that my grandfather had come back and watched over us, that he was sitting in a chair by a table and watching us. I remember seeing my father's eyes welled up in tears as he explained to me and my other sister that he could see our grandfather. He was also told to never go into the woods alone, and also told us that. He explained to us there are things in the woods that we can't understand and that will try to trick us. Evil spirits. I have never forgotten what he's told me, and believe everything he told me about the spirit world. I also firmly believe that what I saw and what he experienced are very real. I am sorry if this information seems jumbled. Hopefully you can make sense of it. To make it more clear, when I was 8, my grandfather passed. We were at his celebration of life, where my father basically saw my grandfather and informed us to be careful while being in the woods. Fast forward to being 12 years old, and I had my first sighting of these strange creatures. Now that only lasted for about 2 weeks. Fast forward to when I was older, and I finally got a chance to tell my dad about it. Hopefully that clears things up. I was born in a small Midwestern town. Back then, I loved spending my free time outdoors, exploring the woods, and hunting with my buddies. In fact, it was my senior year of high school, and I had these grand plans of joining the Marine Corps right after graduation, travel the world, and come back home to eventually settle down. Now, let me tell you about that strange year. I remember it started on a pretty typical weekend, hanging out with my crew at our favorite off-road spot, kicking back and smoking cigarettes, shooting the hay around a bonfire. You think this story would be about some weekend shenanigans in the woods, like a high school horror slasher film. But no. I'd be driving down some nights, blaring some AC/DC like any real red-blooded teenager metalhead would, and I'd swear that I was being followed. Now, it isn't uncommon to see deer or even other wildlife, but this was all so different. I was convinced that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd swore that I'd seen dark, tall figures darting in and out of the woods along the road, moving super fast, though I couldn't make out any clear details. I just had this innate feeling that I was being watched that I could not shake. And every time I tried to catch a better glimpse, it would disappear like the Roadrunner, leaving me questioning my sanity. But here's where things started to get really freaky. My friends began telling me about things they saw. One friend in particular described seeing a massive, shadowy figure watching him from his fence line, along with other unexplainable noises and weird smells. The small town in which we lived was backed up right against a rather large section of national forest, although I don't know if that has any part to play in all of this. We were all a bit on edge for a while, and of course none of us wanted to be called chicken, so we kept our fears on the down low, thinking that fear was contagious and nobody wanted to be the first to admit it. But as the school year progressed, these events became more and more frequent, and soon rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some even claimed that Satanists had performed a ritual and spawned a werewolf. I know, crazy. This was also during the height of the whole satanic panic. We were just a group of pranksters trying to scare the living daylights out of others, remember? I mean, even I remember a time when we went out with our girlfriends and we took them to this place that we all called Old Slaughterhouse Road. You guessed it. It was an abandoned, isolated, and really creepy. And we, being the brave gentlemen that we were, thought it would be the perfect place to go get some tail late at night. Boy, were we wrong. We pulled up our cars to the crumbling remains of the Old Slaughterhouse Road. Actually, if I remember correctly, there was supposedly an old abandoned slaughterhouse that went out in the early 1950s near the end of this road somewhere in the woods. We never went and explored it, and I never personally saw it, but I believe that that's where the legend of that name comes from. Anyway, as we were settling in for some quality time, we had heard some strange growling noises from the dark surrounding us. Our first instinct was to bravely huddle together and hope that whatever it was would go away. But then, I like to say the unthinkable happened. Eyes suddenly appeared in the darkness, glaring directly at us from a distance. And I kid you not, it felt like evil was coming toward us. We could now see large animal-like snouts and pointed, tall ears. We were sure that we saw a pack of werewolves. We got out of there real quick. Our ladies never went back with us either. Then, there were these strange sounds all around my house at night after that. I couldn't sleep a wink. I would lay in bed just hearing the howls and the growling noises and feeling the eeriness that seemed to surround my house. I was even scared at times to take out the garbage. Each night, the strange cacophony seemed to grow louder and more unnerving. My folks dismissed it as coyotes or maybe rambunctious raccoons. But I just knew that there was something more sinister, something related to what we saw near Old Slaughterhouse Road. My buddies and I decided that we couldn't take it anymore. We had to find out what was going on. So we kind of formed our own little monster hunting crew, taking our shotguns and baseball bats, and my one friend even had a rusty machete that he found in his dad's garage. Although, looking back, I don't think it would have done much damage. On one particular night, it was pretty windy, I remember. Our courage, bolstered by the camaraderie, and perhaps a beer or two, we decided to investigate the creepy noises and attempt to get to the bottom of this mystery. Who am I kidding? We were 16, 17, and 18. We weren't going to get down to the bottom of much. But hey, we tried. We ventured deep into the woods, flashlights flickering, our senses on high alert. And as you can imagine, we jumped at every twig snap and leaf rustling. We were determined to confront what we saw that night, to prove its existence. Hours went by, and our adrenaline began to wear off. We began to ask ourselves that, just maybe, this whole thing really was coyotes. I mean, how else would you describe it? But we stumbled upon something that we still can't explain. A mangled and barely recognizable carcass of a deer torn apart with an alarming amount of brutality. Here's the other part. It was nearly 30 feet up in a tree. The sight of the carnage and the lingering smell of death was enough to convince us that we were getting close to this pack's den, and that we were somewhere very, very near. But we continued our search, our resolve now stronger than ever. And that's when we saw it, or what I would call it, what I would call the werewolf. Its massive, muscular form nearly towered around us, with these soul-piercing eyes. Its fur was filthy with dried blood on it, and its snout and paws, presumably from its latest meal. You could almost feel the pure evil emanating from it. We didn't hesitate. Our instincts kicked in. We took aim, let loose our entire arsenal upon the creature. Shotgun blast, pellets, various other projectiles. But the creature seemed unfazed, dodging our attacks or just standing there. It emitted a bone-chilling noise that shook us. We all ran and fled for our lives. We didn't talk much on the way back to our vehicles. What we had encountered was beyond anything we had ever experienced or imagined, and we were left struggling to make sense of it. Now, of course, at this time, you had the whole uprising of werewolf movies, Stephen King's The Silver Bullet, and of course The Howling, so this is part of the reason why we never told anybody. But man, I kid you not, what we ran into that night and the night on the old Slaughterhouse Road was very similar to something from those movies. It scared us all pretty badly, and I'm sure as you're listening to this, you're probably thinking that this is just some cheesy creepypasta story, but I'm here to tell you that what we experienced was very real and had a very lasting effect on all of us. And like I said, we never talked about it for the longest time, because we didn't know what to call what we had encountered. The only thing we could possibly think of was a werewolf because it looked just like it. Now, it wasn't until recent years where a buddy of mine actually sent me a link over Facebook that talked about a sighting very similar to what we had experienced. And I guess these creatures are called Dogman. And turns out there's actually a whole legend on it that I wasn't even aware of. So I guess you could say that's what we saw that night. Of course, over the years, the encounters have become more than just a memory. They've now become a way that almost dictates how I live my life. Always trying to be more open-minded of what's around me, and understanding that there's still things out there that we'll never fully know about. In 1985, I worked for the U.S. military on a variety of projects, and this particular one goes way back. At the time, I was working on a bunch of, I guess what you would call hush-hush, top-of-the-food chain type projects. I know, it sounds crazy, but then again, you're probably no stranger to the wild and unusual. So, I was there, smack dab in the middle of the Mojave Desert, working on, I guess what you could call some sci-fi stuff that I still really can't talk about even today. But trust me when I say that it was some seriously advanced tech, the likes of which would make your head spin. But hey, that ain't what I'm here to share, so let's get to the good stuff. My crew and I worked long hours, usually pretty late into the night, actually. We were all pretty wiped, running on caffeine and adrenaline just from trying to keep up with this life-changing tech. It was no ordinary job, let me tell you. Anyway, so there was this one night, a real scorcher. We were all beat and just about ready to call it a day. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky all sorts of crazy, beautiful colors. And we decided to kick back and enjoy for a minute. And as we're sitting there, we noticed something. You see, our eyes kept catching glimpses of these, what you could call little wisps of light. They were sort of dancing around the outskirts of our camp. Now, at first, we were brushing it off as nothing more than some funky mirage. The last gasp of the desert heat playing tricks on our tired, exhausted brains. After all, most of us were incredibly sleep-deprived. But as night crept up on us, those little lights didn't go away. If anything, they got brighter. We all shared a nervous chuckle, and out of morbid curiosity, we made the choice to all investigate together. Maybe it was fatigue, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just our instincts telling us not to ignore something out of the ordinary. Whatever it was, we did investigate. I can't emphasize enough how weird this was. I mean, of course, we're military trained and used to dealing with strange things, but this was something else. Picture it. A bunch of tough-as-nails military folk creeping through the Mojave Desert, drawn towards this mysterious light like moths to a flame. As we get closer, we started realizing that these little lights were more than just some natural phenomenon. They had this eerie, otherworldly glow about them, and they seemed to move with purpose, like they were alive or something. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, or worse, lured into a trap. Now, after what felt like hours of walking, though it was probably about 50 minutes, we, what I assume, would stumble across the source of these lights. Well, what we found isn't something you would see every day. In a small clearing was this thing. It was uncanny. Like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, it stood tall, at least 9 feet, long, spindly limbs, and the strangest looking head you'd ever seen. It had big, black, almond-shaped eyes that almost seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Its skin was like nothing we'd ever seen before. It was like a mix of reptilian scales and that alien gray skin that you hear about. Now, we were trained to keep our cool in these sorts of tense situations, but this was too much. We couldn't help but stand there, mouths agape, staring at this unbelievable sight in front of us. It didn't make a move. It just stood there, perfectly still. It wasn't just this being, though, that stunned us. It was the lights surrounding it. There were these orb-like lights floating in midair, like nothing we'd ever seen or could begin to explain. The orbs seemed to respond to its presence, dancing and pulsating in some bizarre harmony that we couldn't quite make sense of. After what felt like an eternity, it's like we finally snapped back into reality. We had to leave, and now, we couldn't be there all night. We fled. We retreated back to our base. And here's the real kicker. Once we had a chance to catch our breath and collect ourselves, we found all of our equipment, and I mean everything, had stopped working. Radios, phones, the dang watches on our wrists. It's like all of our tech had been zapped, leaving us completely stranded. Now, I'm not the one for jumping to conclusions, but everything we'd witnessed that night, it didn't take a genius to put 2 and 2 together. We were miles from anywhere potential witnesses to one of the most incredible occurrences we'd ever seen, and suddenly, all our means of communication had gone haywire. It seemed all too convenient, like someone or something was trying to keep us quiet. The rest of that night was kind of a blur. I don't know if it was exhaustion, shock, or something else. We all struggled to make sense of it, and by the time the sun rose, none of us had gotten a lick of sleep, and we knew we had to find a way to explain our situation. Apparently, a few of us actually tried to explain this to our superiors, but were immediately threatened and told to keep quiet. So I don't have the answers, and honestly, I'm sure I don't want to know. It seems that we stumbled upon something we shouldn't have. I'm sure you're no stranger to terrifying, large, and harrowing fish found out at sea by fishermen. Just like many of the details you describe in your accounts listed on your channel. Well, I too have an interesting story about a very large, what I'll call an unknown fish. While I was cage diving with great white sharks off the coast of Mexico, many years back, around 2002. To be exact, I'll spare you all the boring details about going out there on the boat, whom I was with, getting suited up, and getting into the cage, because that's pretty redundant. But anyway, great white shark diving is something that's amazing. If you ever get the chance to do it, it's quite an adrenaline thrill. In fact, I was loving it, and having the time of my life. I'm not really what you'd call an adrenaline junkie, or even a thrill seeker, but this was something that I had to cross off my bucket list, at least once. Anyway, here's where things get crazy. I'm in the cage, watching these beautiful and large majestic fish swim all around me, knowing I'm literally within 20 feet of a man-eating predator, as Hollywood portrays them to be. There's 3 of them swimming around me, and I noticed their sudden disinterest in swimming, if that makes any sense. They kind of start to trail off towards the other directions out into the open sea, and as I sat there confused, wondering why they're no longer swimming around me, I began to see that deep below me, underneath me, a very, very large shape was beginning to emerge closer to the surface. Now, at first, I assumed this might be a whale, but this shape, whatever it was, never fully surfaced enough that I could really make out vivid details. All I can really tell you is that it was very, very large, a dark shadow of something, and it seemed to be moving. Maybe it was a craft of some kind. It's hard to say. It looked very long, like if you were to take a sperm whale and enlarge it even more. I'm terrible at describing things, but the best way I can describe it is it was some large marine animal or fish, or something that was much, much larger than any great white that I've ever seen. But again, I can't give you great details. It never fully surfaced enough, even in the water, that I could make out what it was. What I can only assume, looking back on the event, is that this thing approaching us made the great white sharks flee. Now you tell me, what's out there in the ocean that the sheer presence of a fish makes even great white sharks flee? So, that's something that's left for another day of mysteries. And I'm not kidding when I say that the shape of this thing was massive. It engulfed the entirety underneath my cage. And again, it was just a black mass. I couldn't tell what it was, but it seemed to go in front of me, below me, and behind me for maybe only a moment or two before submerging back down to the depths to where I couldn't see it anymore. After that, the sharks stayed gone. Once I went back up to the boat, I didn't tell them what had happened. I only mentioned how the sharks just seemed to lose interest. That was it. It didn't really scare me as much as it makes me think about all the ancient mysteries that the ocean holds. I feel foolish for saying this, but I think I saw something that might have been out of place, whatever that means. I was at my grandfather's lake house, out in the woodland area of Louisiana, just last summer, and I had an encounter with some kind of creature, or I guess it would be a lake creature. I know that sounds crazy, like some sort of Hollywood movie plot. But I promise you, the truth is stranger than fiction. I couldn't fully understand or describe what it was. I'm hoping someone can help me identify what it might be. After doing some researching, I found your channel and saw you were doing a series about lake and sea creatures. Maybe one of your followers might be my ticket into getting a resolution to what I'm about to explain. My father and I go fishing a few times during the summer every year at the same lake where my grandfather's house is situated. This particular year was no different. It was just like any other trip this time. We got out our gear together, did our traditional cola pop chug, downing a can of soda in one big gulp, and rowed out into the lake. Normally, I will row around till Dad is satisfied that we have found the right spot, because Dad is a more experienced fisherman. He lets me go first, hooking my bait onto the hook and casting it into the water. I just sat and wait. When Dad cast his pole, he got a bite almost immediately, and he pulls out a little 3-inch trout, which would explain how he caught it so fast. You see, baby adolescent fish aren't smart enough to stay away from your bait, even though they know what it is, so they're easier to catch. We don't take our phones out on the boat, so I can't ever accurately judge what time it is, other than looking up at the sun and guessing by its location. I would say maybe 45 minutes went by after he caught his fish that I finally had a bite. It was definitely a fighter. After a lot of persistent pulling and leading, I finally started reeling it in. Just as I was about to take it out of the water, a larger fish grabbed it from me, hook and all, and took it away. I rehooked my line, throwing it back into the water. I don't know why, but larger fish always love taking my smaller bites. Luckily, I had another bite a little while later, and I was determined not to let this one get away from me. I let it lead around for a little while before starting to reel it in hard. I waited long enough to see if it caught the fish off guard. Then, yanking hard, I started to reel it in, and as I was lifting it out of the water, I saw another fish trying to snag it from me. I yanked it out of the water quickly, but that didn't stop the other fish from jumping out of the water to bite it as I pulled it away. It wasn't much larger than the fish I pulled out of the water, yet it was definitely a predator. When it landed back in the water, oddly enough, it stared at me for a minute before swimming underneath. It was a pale blue fish with weird yellow and brown eyes. It didn't look like it had scales, but almost like it had skin. Thinking about it, I'm not quite sure it was a fish at all. Its head resembled a fish, but it didn't look like a fish that I had ever seen before. I told Dad that I had used the restroom. I rowed back to shore and thought to myself, I am done for the day. I didn't tell my dad what I had seen, but I think the lake and the heat were messing with my head. It was quite hot out there, and we had no shade. I think I just needed to lie down to get rid of the ominous headache that I had developed. We went out again the next day. I had chose a different spot in the lake for us, just in case whatever I'd seen yesterday happened to still be out there. It took a while for either of us to get a bite on our lines, and whatever happened to the fish must have happened overnight. I had told my dad jokingly we must have caught all the fish yesterday, and the lake was up for the summer. He laughed at me and said we should just find another spot after being in the same spot for the same 2 hours and not finding anything. It was considered bad luck. So I rowed over to a spot near the edge of the lake on the farther side of the lake that faces the woodlands. Not much activity was happening until my father got a fish. I don't know what he caught, but it was significantly large. He was losing his grip on the pole. When I helped him hold onto the pole and the fish came out of the water, it must have been a 16-inch fish. Okay, so not enormous, but it was definitely better than a 3-inch trout. But that's not what surprised me. What did surprise me was the gigantic bite that was taken out of the side of it. The reason it was so hard to reel in and felt so heavy, because we were fighting with something that was already eating it. We looked around in the water and could see those faint glowing yellow eyes. Then I realized perhaps it was the same thing from the other day. My dad actually kind of got spooked after that, and decided we better call it a day. We rowed back to shore. We had to go to the store to buy something for dinner, since we had not caught any fish that day, except the half-eaten one that we had pulled out of the lake. Dad said he wasn't getting as much excitement out of fishing this year. I told him if tomorrow didn't go any better, that I would be okay with heading home early. The next morning, I woke up early, went out to the lake to sit on the dock. I watched the water as the sun rose. I couldn't see any fish in the water from where I was. Normally, you come out there that early, and it looks almost as if the whole lake is moving, as the fish are swimming, creating an orchestra of colors. Not today, though. Across the water to the spot where we'd struggled to catch the fish yesterday, I then saw a fawn coming out of the woods towards the edge of the water. I watched it as it stumbled across the ground, dipping its head to the water to drink from it. It was so peaceful, until something long and pale came out of the water, bit onto its neck, pulling it down into the depths of the murky water in a matter of seconds. I stood up, frantically looking around to see if the fawn got out of the water. But after several moments, I could only assume what had happened. I just sighed and went back inside. I walked into the kitchen to find Dad drinking his coffee. I didn't tell him what I saw happen to the fawn. I didn't tell him about the stillness of the lake, and there didn't appear to be any fish. There wasn't any reason for staying for another day of fishing. My father was greatly disappointed, but he knew I was right. When we had packed up all of our stuff and loaded onto our truck, I turned to look back at the lake one last time. And I swear, just like out of some sort of nightmare, I could faintly see glowing eyes staring at me from underneath the water just offshore. And then something far more horrifying happened in that very moment. We both heard some swishing around like something heavy was under the dock. That was when we saw the body, or should I say half-eaten body, of the dead fawn from earlier that morning floating out from underneath the dock into view. There really wasn't much left of it, other than a massive heap of torn-up, eaten-on flesh and a leg or two, which was the only real way you could even discern it was still a fawn, or had been a fawn. It's safe to say that my father and I don't go fishing out there anymore. The fear I felt that day will be forever burned into my memory. This happened in the early 90s, when I was in 5th grade. I had a black and white cat named Bucky. Bucky loved to be outside and would often disappear for a few days while roaming the neighborhood or woods behind my house. He would sometimes return with battle scars from his adventures. I remember fearing that someday he would meet an untimely demise due to his curiosity and fearlessness. Well, that demise finally came to fruition one early morning during my summer break. I was home alone when I received a phone call from my mother. It was around 10 that morning. I could hear in her voice that she was very upset. She told me the news that I had always dreaded. She found Bucky dead on the side of the road while leaving for work that morning. She had seen him in the glow of her car lights while exiting the neighborhood onto the busy road into town. She had then came back home, grabbed a garbage bag, scooped him up, and placed it in the garage. I was obviously upset, but not bawling my eyes out upset. Like I mentioned before, I knew something like this would happen one day. I told my mom I would take him and bury him in the pet cemetery out back in the woods. The pet cemetery was just a small clearing on my neighbor's land, where quite a few people in the neighborhood had also buried their pets. There was probably only about a dozen pets buried out there, with makeshift grave markers made of wood crosses or large stones. I solemnly walked out to the garage, and there in the corner, I saw the large black garbage bag. I didn't dare open it up and look inside. I had no idea what kind of condition he was in, nor did I want to know. I grabbed a shovel and the bag, and then headed off into the woods. Now, this was in the early 1990s, and just a few years earlier, the Stephen King movie Pet Sematary had come out. I remember watching it on the VCR with my dad and getting the crap scared out of me. I loved scary movies, but that one had a huge, terrifying impact on my young psyche. This movie absolutely was on my mind while I walked down the heavily wooded path on that hot summer day. And finally, there it was, slightly down a sloping hill on the edge of a swamp, the pet cemetery. I jabbed the shovel into the moist, leafy soil and began digging. I didn't dig far, though, only about 2 feet down. I grabbed the garbage bag, lowered it into the shallow hole. I teared up a little bit and said my goodbye to Bucky. It only took a few moments to cover the hole up, and I grabbed a nearby stick to use as a temporary grave marker. I figured I'd make something a little more special for his grave later. I located the trail again and made the long, sad walk back home. A few hours went by. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich for lunch, doing whatever I could to take my mind off the loss of my beloved cat. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Suddenly, I hear a long, drawn-out meow coming from the back door. I freeze in shock and I listen again. And there it was, another meow. This time, followed up by a rabid scratching at the back screen door, just like Bucky always did when coming home from an adventure. This can't be happening, I thought. Images from the movie flash into my brain. The cat from that movie returning from the dead as an evil reincarnation of itself, hissing and stinking of death. My heart pounded as I listened again, hoping it was just my imagination running wild. I walked into the family room, staring at the back door, and there it was again, a long, drawn-out meow, followed by a fury of scratching. I thought about calling my mother, but I couldn't wait. I just had to open that door. I could hear my actual heartbeat ringing in my ears as I grabbed the handle of the back door and slowly opened it. I looked down, and sure enough, there is Bucky. He is innocently looking up at me with a look of, "Hey, let me in, I'm hungry." He didn't look bloody, muddy, or like some kind of evil zombie cat, like in the movie. He looked completely fine. So I let him in, and he goes about his business and acts as if it's just another day. Bucky was his usual self, and went to live on another couple of years before passing away. I've tried to rationalize this in my brain so many times, and there is one very legit and logical explanation for what actually happened that day. In the early pre-dawn darkness, my mom saw a dead cat on the side of the road that looked very similar to my cat, and since my cat had been gone overnight, assumed this was Bucky. I then proceeded to drag this random cat back into the woods and bury it in the pet cemetery. All the while, good old Bucky was just outside on one of his adventures, oblivious to this disturbing misidentification that had taken place. A few days later, I did actually go back to the cemetery and observed that the fresh grave that I had dug to still be completely undisturbed. I mean, that has to be what happened, right? I mean, there's only one other alternative to what happened that day, and I'd rather not believe that my cat came back from the dead after getting buried in the pet cemetery. I was 11 years old when my family moved to a new town. It didn't take long before I made a new friend down at the end of the block. Her house was located on the corner of a T intersection that dead-ended into a field with lots of trees and a tiny, shallow stream. My friend and I sometimes played there, but generally did not go more than 20 feet into the wooded property. There wasn't much wooded land, as probably about 50 or so feet on the other side was a road that was not connected to ours, and we knew that was farther than we were allowed to go. The stream was about 5 inches deep, and we did have fun playing within eyesight of my friend's house. We never saw anybody else there, and we never had any problems. Another new addition to the block besides myself was a man in his 20s who was just recently married. He moved in across from my friend. He was a nice man and a firefighter. His wife was kind to us and let us play with their cat a couple of times a week. One day, while playing in the stream, we ventured farther than usual. I don't remember why, but we weren't really paying attention to our surroundings. We didn't make it very far because the stream petered out, becoming muddy and full of dead leaves. We were about to turn back when in a small clearing just before us, we saw something unusual. Something dark and flying or hovering in midair. We made our way forward, cautiously, to get a better look. As I strained my eyes in the gloom of the trees, it blurred my vision around me, becoming a hazy background of orange, yellow, and red, punctuated by the deep black of wet tree bark peeking out here and there. The October air was crisp and clean, but the weak sun failed to penetrate the meager but complete canopy of dying leaves overhead. Before long, the black thing before me began to take shape, and I soon saw that it was not hovering over the clearing like I thought. It was hanging by a wire. My eyes traveled up the wire to where it was wrapped around a branch that jutted out over the clearing. Still not understanding what exactly I was seeing, I let my eyes travel down the wire to the black object. The wire was wrapped around what I soon realized was the leg of an animal. The wire was being used to suspend the animal quite low, in clear view of anyone under 6 feet tall. It was so low that any adults could easily reach it without the need of a ladder. Without thinking, we went closer to discover that it was not originally the color black. It was black because it was charred. It looked sooty and greasy with patches of orange fur. The animal, now looking very much like a cat, had been murdered and burned. Yes, now I'm wondering if it was burned alive, but that didn't occur to me back then. Thank God. My friend and I looked at each other with shock. She was scared to death, her face pale, and her eyes wide. I'm sure I looked pretty much the same to her, and without a word, we turned around and hightailed it straight out of the trees, past the stream, and out onto the street. We confirmed with one another that we both just saw a burned dead cat hanging from a tree. We agreed we needed to tell an adult right away. It made sense to go to the new neighbor since he was a fireman, second only in authority to a policeman, and his wife was always home during the day. Their house was also close to the end of the street where we were playing, and, well, they had a cat. We knocked on his door, and the fireman answered and asked us what was going on. We told him what we had just seen and that he needed to come look. He took us seriously, and looking concerned, pulled on his jacket and stepped out the door. We took him through the small wooded area along the stream to the clearing. There he saw what we saw, a charred cat hanging from a wire from a tree branch over the clearing. I could see he was shocked by the sight of the charred body, and he began looking closer at our surroundings, which was something my friend and I had not done. Then he suddenly exclaimed, "Girls, be careful!" We looked around, expecting to see more burned cats or a person, but instead, we found that he was pointing to areas on the ground and at the trees. He instructed us not to move and kneeled down to show us more wire. There was a lot of it, and I followed his finger as he traced its path from one tree to another, making a perimeter around the clearing. It was wrapped around the tree trunks about 1 foot from the ground, meant to make whoever wanted to get close to trip and fall. He then stood up, pointing to pieces of metal in the trunks of the trees. They were razor blades, he said, set into the bark of each tree, sharp edge facing out. Our fireman friend said they were put there so someone would cut themselves if they tripped on the wire and tried to catch themselves on a tree trunk. It was a trap. The cat was bait, he explained. It was bait for a human, though, meant to catch a person's attention and lure him into the clearing in order to cause them harm. I didn't understand why, and when I asked, he said he didn't know. I asked if the cat was his. He said he did not know. There's more to this story than we were ever told. Bad enough to make the firemen move away only months after moving in. I had never seen anything like this before, and it took me a long time to understand the level of hatred and malevolence that was behind the act of murdering and burning my neighbor's cat. Not to mention the illness of someone who would booby-trap an area against innocent children. It was scary but also surreal, and had left quite an impression on my young mind. Whatever was going on, whether it was meant for us, kids, or neighbor, or someone else, I hope to never see such a thing again. I want to preface this by saying that, in my career as an officer, I've seen some odd things. It's just the nature of the job, I suppose. But there's one incident specifically that stands out from the rest, and even now, I'm not entirely sure what happened or what it is that I saw. It happened right around the time I was getting ready to retire, and even I'll admit, it shook me to my core and defied everything I thought that was normal. It was a warm summer night, perfect for cruising. I was out, just going down the old dusty black roads that led through some of the more rural communities of our town. The shift had been unusually quiet. There was only a few minor disturbances, but nothing too out of the ordinary. That all changed when I got a call from the dispatcher, telling me that supposedly a local rancher was reporting frequent UFO sightings and he needed an officer there now. This instantly intrigued me. I wasn't one to even buy into that kind of nonsense, but I couldn't help but just feel drawn to this. I'd always believed that people claiming to see UFOs were just mistaking either strange weather phenomena or even military aircraft of some kind. I figured the call would be a great way to wrap up my night. But little did I know just how wrong I was. I made the way out there, probably about 12 minutes from my current location, and as I approached, I could see the owner outside frantically waving his arms and pointing at the sky. I pulled up, got out of my cruiser, and I was immediately struck by just how quiet it was around us. The rancher led me around the back of his house, pointing to a spot in the sky. All I could see was the moon and a few stars. I already wasn't believing anything he was trying to sell me. Now, just as I was about to tell him it was likely a mistaken sighting, something happens. Off in the distance, him and I both see what looks like a group of lights swirling and hovering around, but moving erratically, changing hues from green to blue to red. But way up in the sky, it's almost kind of like they were blinking in and out of existence. Now, normally, the rational side of me would have tried to chalk this up to a plane or a helicopter or maybe some sort of light reflection or anomaly. Except that what we were seeing defied any rational explanation for any of those things. It was moving far too fast, and it was just so out of place. And in no ways have I ever seen aircraft that could possibly move like this. I'll never forget when my heart started pounding and I watched these lights zip around and move in slightly altering formations. They seemed completely unaffected by gravity or our realm of physics. As if things couldn't get stranger from there, the objects suddenly, while keeping their momentum and color changing, began to move in our direction and fast. The rancher began screaming, took off running behind a nearby tractor, grabbing his rifle, watching intently. I was rooted to the spot, unsure of what was about to happen. And nearly instantly, they disappeared. With a second or two later, they would blink back in, much the same way something would glitch in and out. Kind of reminded me of the movie The Matrix, actually. But now that it was much closer, I could see that these lights were actually what I would assume to be crafts of some kind. I could make out, not very well, but at the distance I was at, these dark, almost cylindrical-like shapes beneath these lights, but not much else. If it was a craft, there was no propulsion system or exhaust. At least that was visible. These lights continued to stay there, rotating quicker and quicker, before they shot up really high in the sky and completely blinked out of existence. The rancher and I were left standing there, bewildered beyond your imagination. Neither of us could comprehend what had just happened. While my rational mind tries to continuously come up with explanations for what happened that night, deep down, I feel like I've been changed, that I know the truth. I simply saw something that defies all logic and understanding. Something that, for better or worse, shook my world and forced me to confront the unknown. Now, I've kept this story mostly to myself over the years, unsure of how people would react. But as time goes on, you get braver. And I've realized that sometimes there are mysteries that will never be solved. Maybe they were never meant to be solved. All I know is that I don't think we're alone. At least, not as much as we think. The incident I'm about to tell you about occurred in eastern Texas. I had very recently become a police officer. I guess you could say I was pretty green. And on the particular night in question, it was around midnight. It was spring. I remember probably sometime around May, if my memory serves me correctly. It was wet, and it had been raining. And the road in which I was driving on is quite curvy and bumpy. Lots of bends, lots of twists and turns, with thick foliage and trees surrounding the road on both sides. I was driving slow and cautiously because there are a lot of deer that run through the area. Now, right about before it started, I had just come around a very sharp bend in the road, going quick, then to slow, and then to quick as I entered another straight. Right as I started to speed back up, a large buck came barreling across the road in front of me, causing me to slam on my brakes. And not even 2 seconds later, the strangest thing I've ever seen happens. This entity, or what I would call an entity, comes barreling out right after it, stopping right at the start of the road, just looking dumbfounded, as if I was there. I wasn't sure if what I was looking at was human. In fact, I don't think it was. It had a very grotesque-looking face. Large black eyes that were oval, sitting on a very flat, sunken-in face. Its features of its body were very exaggerated. It seemed very sickly, overly slender with patches or what I would describe as bloody scabs all over its body. Think like mange, but not quite. Its arms were extremely exaggerated, hanging down to nearly its feet. Its legs were shorter. After maybe no more than a few seconds, it did this sort of crouch position, and then leapt up into the air. And after that, I didn't see where it went. I wouldn't waste any more time looking for it. I sped off quickly, getting out of there because I had no idea what it was I was dealing with here, and I didn't know if it was dangerous or could hurt me. So, let me tell you about this wild experience my buddy David and I had while we were investigating strange noises in a very remote forest. We like to consider ourselves cryptid hunters. We've always been very intrigued by this area. I guess supposedly there's a whole family of these creatures there. Anyway, one night in September, during a full moon, things got pretty intense. We were chilling at a spot we like to call Lookout Point. It's this tall hill where we can see pretty much everything around us. We had been hearing what we believe were a couple of Bigfoots. We could hear them moving through the leaves and occasionally making these banging noises and wood knocks from various locations. But after a while, it seemed their vibe changed. They seemed way more on edge. David heard something weird coming from the east and went to check it out. I stayed back at Lookout Point, just in case it was a distraction or a trap. He came back freaked out and told me he actually saw some of them sprinting out of the trees. What really freaked him out is that it appears they were being chased by what he described was a 7-foot-tall creature with pointy ears and a long snout chasing it. And neither of us had ever bought into the whole Dogman thing. We always thought those sightings were just misidentified Bigfoots or even bears. But after what David saw, I grabbed my 9mm and I headed to the truck. I loaded it up, and we decided to investigate a little further. We went to the spot where he supposedly saw this thing, and with our flashlights, we began looking around. We could still hear something big moving and growling nearby. Then, David caught a glimpse of it in between the trees. I couldn't believe my eyes. A 7-foot-tall wolf standing on its hind legs. I fired my gun into the air, and this thing took off. We decided to follow it, but it was clear this thing was not afraid of us. It felt like it was hunting us, just like it had been hunting those young Bigfoot that we had suspected had been in the area. As it came out of the trees, I took a shot at it, hitting it in the chest. I would later measure the distance. I saw the wound, so I know I hit it, but it got back up and kept moving. We were spooked, so we fled. We packed up and got out of there. We eventually came back to see if maybe it had died. Nothing. There was no blood trail. We followed where it went down into this canyon, and we found a huge canine paw print in the mud. It was like 12 inches across. We tracked it as far as we could, but we eventually lost the trail. Afterwards, we had reached out to a couple close friends of ours who believed we really had encountered a dogman. After that night, though, none of us really wanted to investigate it any further. My story begins in a small rural town where both sets of grandparents lived close by. As an only child, born in 1985, I was fortunate enough to spend ample quality time with them throughout my formative years, especially since they were always eager to have me around as much as possible. In the summer of 2003, when I was 18, my grandparents on my mother's side needed someone to watch over their property while they were away for a month's time. They owned a vast and beautiful ranch just nestled outside of Mariposa in California, and that town lays at the base of the foothills leading towards the Sierra Nevadas. This peaceful piece of land had always been one dearly loved by our family. Running along one end was an enchanting creek, populated with lush bamboo stalks stretching high into the sky. It almost seemed to transport you to another world. It was during their absence that I had one of the most remarkable and terrifying experiences of my life. One Friday evening, after finishing up some chores around the property, and I decided to venture out into Angel Slough with our family dog, Jasper, an intrepid German shepherd who rarely ever showed any signs of fear or hesitation. We walked through fields dotted with oak trees before arriving at the dense bamboo thicket surrounded by the limpid waters. We followed along its edge for about a half-mile straight towards what is known as Old Man's Crossing, a shallow area where locals have passed for years to reach neighboring ranches. The sky started turning into an orange palette as dusk settled. Jasper and I were just about halfway when we heard something crashing through the vegetation nearby. At first, it sounded like branches snapping underfoot, paired with faint huffing sounds that nearly resembled labored breathing or the grunting of some large animal. My initial thoughts were perhaps a bear again roamed these parts, since they occasionally frequented this region in search of food around harvest time, albeit quite unusual given our proximity to the houses throughout town. Jasper seemed uneasy, his ears pricked up and eyes fixed on a point in the dense foliage before us. As we both stared at where he was looking, my heart skipped a beat when I spotted this creature. What emerged from the bamboo thicket left me frozen with equal parts fear and awe. It stood around 4 feet tall, but appeared as if it might be hunched over slightly, like an animal preparing to charge or leap forward. Its skin had that odd gray-brown shade akin to old tree bark, almost blending into surroundings effortlessly. The being ran unnervingly fast on 2 legs, disappearing from sight and leaving only faint rustling sounds in its wake. The strangest aspect of it all was the way this moved, stooped low to the ground while running on long limbs with unnervingly large hands or paws stretched out before itself, almost reminiscent of a primate's gait. Both Jasper and I remained rooted at our spot for what felt like an eternity before rushing back home as quickly as possible after regaining some sense enough to move once more. In hindsight, that might be deemed foolish, considering we did not know where exactly Leary Thing had fled or if it was still lurking nearby. But at that moment, the overwhelming urge to escape had overpowered any rational thought. Now, upon returning home, I immediately barricaded myself inside and spent a sleepless night replaying events in my mind, attempting to just make sense what happened. The next day, armed with newfound courage, and Jasper by my side, we did revisit Old Man's Crossing, hoping evidence would reveal an explanation for our sighting. Sadly, only more questions ensued, as no trace could be found near where the creature appeared or vanished, other than some trampled bamboo stalks leading deeper into the thicket where it had emerged from. In hindsight, it seemed almost as if nature itself bent to accommodate and conceal its presence, overwhelmed with befuddling uncertainty about this bizarre happening. I hesitated sharing my experience with my loved ones or even the local police, fearing mockery or the imagination running wild. Tales of seeing extraterrestrial beings in rural areas have always been dismissed by skeptics, labeling us as crackpots seeking attention from others like ourselves who believe such foolish phenomena exist. Well, I'm here to tell you, most people can't comprehend what they would witness to be true. Even after years of pondering retrospectively over this encounter, it has remained in my mind, permanently etched in my memory. I cannot shake the feeling it was something genuinely beyond our known reality. Let me introduce myself. You can call me David. I am a primary school teacher from Northern Ireland. I came across your channel very recently. I would like to share an experience that has been disturbing and wreaking havoc on my mental health. I've taken a leave of absence from teaching over the past year. I have concluded that I don't believe I'll be able to return to work anytime soon. And it's not just because of COVID. It is about an encounter during the summer of 2018 with something in the ocean that, to this day, I still can't explain. At the end of each school year, the teachers of the 7th grade at the primary school take their students on a field trip to a coastal resort. It's all to wish them farewell before they enter secondary school. The weekend is always memorable. It's packed with many activities and fun. The children, mostly 11 years old, really enjoy doing it. And so do the teachers. Over the past decade, I've looked forward to the annual trip, and I've done so with great pleasure. Yet in 2018, that all changed. I was the designated teacher for a group of 5 children. It was my job to take them out in the ocean for a short canoeing excursion. This was just off the coast of Cork. And to say it was picturesque would be a complete understatement. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be Irish, and how blessed I was to have a job allowing me such a beautiful spot, and to get paid for it all at the same time. We all went out on the water in our canoes, everybody wearing their life jackets for safety. In addition, we all carried whistles with us, just in case of any difficulty. Canoeing was not a new experience for most children. Some had a natural talent for it. But one child on the autism spectrum was high-functioning, but had poor hand-eye coordination and struggled to use his oar. I had to help him and spend a little extra time showing him the technique. He eventually got the hang of it, so we all adjusted our speed to accommodate him. There was a small sandbar about 1/4 mile from the shore, which was the destination we had in mind for our planned pit stop, for a snack and before heading back to the beach. I had some fruit, biscuits, and juice, all of which were stored in the backpack I had brought along. To guarantee that the children would have adequate energy and to be physically prepared to row the canoe trip back to shore. Reaching the sandbar at low tide allowed the children to explore and collect seashells. After having the snacks, it was time to head back to the beach before high tide would come in. Once in the water, though, the currents became strong. The waves began to make the canoes shaky, and some children said they were struggling to row. It was a bit worrying, but I could see that they weren't far from reaching the shore. Dennis, the child with autism, began to really struggle. First, his oar fell into the water and sank. Then he began to panic. He kept trying to stand up in the canoe, which caused it to rock back and forth violently. I could see the kids in the other canoes becoming scared. I told the others to go ahead and rowed ashore, as I was going to tie a rope onto Dennis's canoe and pull him with me. When I reached him, I noticed something large and green, like the shape of a cobweb, but just under the water. I squinted to see better from the sun's reflection off the water. Looking downwards, I brushed it off as some weird type of seaweed or something. As soon as I tied it around Dennis's boat, I saw this thing circling. It also seemed to pulsate, getting bigger and then smaller again. I just hoped it wasn't a jellyfish or some dangerous sea animal. At the moment, the motion of the water abruptly ceased. I turned around to check on the other children and ensure they were all safely on land. As I turned my attention back to Dennis, a snake that had looked like a serpent leapt out of the water and bit the top of my head. Blood ran down my face due to the large fangs cutting into my skin. In that moment, I felt like I was going to die. I yelled at Dennis to get in my boat, but he was panicking. This thing kept exploding out of the water as quickly as lightning, each time trying to attack my head in an attempt to bite. It was the most frightening experience. I was being attacked while on the water with a very vulnerable child. On top of that, I had never before encountered a marine creature that was so hostile. After being bitten, I could feel the skin on my forehead spreading out. Without a doubt, as a result of a reaction to the venom that was released from this bite. This snake, or whatever it was not very big. It was probably the size of a typical rattlesnake. It was enough to, nevertheless, act aggressive. In addition, I had no idea how poisonous it might have been. I've read that sea snakes have a particularly potent venom. I let out a sigh and a curse. I got Dennis's boat and started paddling like hell. This creature shot up again. Its eyes were like slits, yellow and soulless. I did the best I could to try and avoid it, but to no avail. It bit again. The canoe boat shook and almost nearly capsized with the impact. Eventually, we reached the shore. As I lifted Dennis out of the canoe, he was dripping in cold sweat. The remaining children came running over and gave us hugs. They had seen it all and were traumatized and scared. All of them were pale from shock and required immediate assistance obtaining water and food. We called an ambulance and explained the situation to the dispatcher. I received medical attention and had my wounds dressed. The venom, fortunately, did not prove to be fatal. But I must confess that the memory of that event has remained in my consciousness ever since it occurred. It seems like every instant of every day, I'm reminded of the anxiety and fear I experienced while in that canoe. I fought for my life, not just mine, but for the little kids entrusted to my care. I sincerely feel I will never go back in that canoe again, and I'm reluctant to even go near the water. The last I heard of the kids, their parents had taken them out of public school, and they were being homeschooled for the time being. And poor Dennis had completely retreated into himself. Obviously, what we saw had a scary effect on all of us. In sharing this experience on your program, I hope you can enlighten me and inform me if other such creatures exist and have been sighted by others in the sea. I am aware it was some sort of sea serpent. Nothing crazy like Leviathan or anything. But I've never run into a sea serpent so aggressive. I mean, this thing was intent on bringing me down. So much so that I almost capsized our canoe. I would like to thank you for all your hard work. It is genuinely appreciated. As a former member of the United States Navy, I have experienced many strange and unexplainable things in the course of my duty. But one sighting stands out above all the others. A sighting that has left me with more questions than answers. It was a fairly typical day out at sea. We were anchored in the ocean, waiting for further instructions. It was my job to scan the horizon, but my attention was drawn to a shape in the water that seemed to slowly be moving toward us. At first I panicked, thinking it might be an enemy submarine. But as it got closer, this wasn't that at all. For hours I would watch this shape, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen in all my years with the Navy. It had this strange green-gray metallic sheen to it, and was at least 100 feet in length. But what really caught my attention, what really bothered me, was the fact that it did not show up at all on our sonar equipment. I monitored the situation, logging every detail in my logbook, including time, date, location. I knew this could be something important. I wanted to make sure that I had all the information I could get. As I watched this shape move across the water, I felt this sense of unease, that there was just something about the way it was that told me it was unnatural. The fact that it wasn't showing up on our sonar added to the mystery. Now, I've seen some strange things being in the ocean, but this was different. It was like some sort of device or craft out of a science fiction movie. I could not shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding, at least in a technological sense. The hours wore on, and I continued to keep an eye on the shape, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But no matter how hard I tried or to rationalize it, I couldn't come up with an explanation. Then, it finally disappeared beneath the waves, right around evening. I was left with more questions than answers. In the days that followed, I spent time discussing this with my fellow crew. We all had our theories, but nobody could really offer a solid explanation. Others were very bothered by this. For me, it was a reminder that there are still things out there that we have yet to be uncovered. Navy life, after all, can be tough. Long hours, demanding duties. But if you stick with it, it's also an incredibly rewarding experience, camaraderie, and a very fulfilling sense of purpose. Being a part of the Navy, I always felt like I was a part of something bigger than myself, something that was working to make the world a better place. Now, during all of this, I couldn't help but notice that there was a strange tension among the higher-ups on the ship. Whenever the topic came up, they would quickly change the subject or act as if they did not wish to discuss it at all. It was almost like there was some sort of conspiracy going on, dare I say. And the more I pondered it, the more convinced I became that there was something they weren't telling us. I tried to do digging and talking to other members of our crew, trying to get more information, but no one really had anything. Many of my fellow crew also shared suspicions. I mean, we all had our own theories. Some assumed that it was a secret government project. Others believed it was an extraterrestrial craft. No matter what we thought, it was clear that there was a concerted effort to keep the sighting under wraps. The captain and other higher-ranking officers were all being unusually weird and tight-lipped about the entire thing. It was starting to feel like we were a part of Roswell or some sort of strange cover-up. Rumors began to circulate more and more, from a few friends of mine, that apparently a piece of a craft had actually been spotted in the water. Some claimed that it was studied in a secret underground laboratory, while others believed that it had actually been claimed and was taken to another facility for analysis. Now that's just word of mouth, I don't know. I know there's not a whole lot to this story, but looking back, it really does make me wonder what it could have been. Perhaps it was an experimental ship. Perhaps the Navy was testing something that we were not allowed to know about. We'll never know.